was first in the papers as a 17-year-old because he was at the centre of probably the most infamous cocaine bust in the history of Irish gangland. There was £1.2 million worth of coke was discovered in a Holiday Inn in 2000. And the fallout from that, where both sides, one gang split basically over allegations of how it happened, led to the Crumlin and Drimnagh feud. One side sided with Brian Radigan, one side sided with Fat Freddie Thompson. But a 17-year-old who was there when the drugs were seized was Graham Whelan, and he ultimately went to prison for 6 years for that seizure. But that seizure, it still is relevant even to.
In the early hours of a Dublin morning, when the city still slept beneath a blanket of rain, armed Garda units moved in silence. Their target, a name whispered in fear across years of Irish headlines. Graham the Whig Whelan, a man who once walked the line between legend and lawlessness. But tonight, his world was no longer untouchable. Behind closed doors, someone had threatened one of their own. A Garda officer marked by an unseen enemy. And when the trail of those threats pointed toward Whelan's circle, the streets of South Dublin trembled in anticipation. Because when law enforcement turns its gaze on a man like the Whig, someone is about to fall. Stay with us. By the end of the story, you'll see the evidence that changed everything, and what remains dangerously unanswered. The raid that night didn't happen in isolation. It was the product of weeks of quiet unease rippling through Dublin's policing circles. Behind every sealed warrant and midnight operation, there had been whispered conversations, veiled warnings, and an unspoken fear that someone, somewhere, had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. South Dublin had become the epicenter of that fear, where money and menace often shared the same postcode. It was late September 2025 when senior Garda officials met in a private briefing room, poring over intelligence that pointed to a potential act of retaliation against one of their own. The threats were not random, they were deliberate, targeted, and backed by the kind of confidence that only came from people who believed they were untouchable. That belief was about to be tested. 6 addresses, all tied by invisible strings to the same underworld web, were marked on the board, each representing a potential link to the men who had made those threats. Among those names was one that stood out like a shadow cast across decades of Irish crime: Graham the Whig Whelan. His name carried history, reputation, and infamy in equal measure. To the Garda, he wasn't just another figure in a file. He was a reminder of how deeply organized crime had taken root in Dublin's soil. Whelan's associations ran deep, through the Kinahan cartel, through the Burn network, through the ghosts of old feuds that had painted the city in fear. But beyond the headlines and the courtrooms was a man who had learned to adapt, to survive, to evolve. Once dismissed as a reckless young offender, he had matured into something far more dangerous. A strategist cloaked in respectability. Garda intelligence had reason to believe that his reach was wider than his silence suggested, and that he might have known more about those threats than anyone dared admit. For investigators, this operation wasn't about one man, it was about what his name represented. It was about breaking the illusion that certain doors could never be knocked on, that some men could live comfortably above consequence. The Garda's specialized unit, armed and deliberate, was chosen for its precision and experience in high-risk searches. Each officer knew what was at stake. This wasn't merely a search for evidence, but a statement of authority in a country where organized crime had, for too long, danced with impunity. Intelligence reports had mapped out movements, vehicles, phone calls, and financial trails, painting a picture of a criminal ecosystem still thriving beneath Dublin's calm exterior. What made this moment historic wasn't just the warrant. It was the target. By the time the command was given to move, the city was asleep, unaware that its balance of power was being tested. Within minutes, 6 doors would fall, and one of them would belong to a man once thought beyond the law's reach. The message was clear and deliberate. No one, not even those shielded by influence, would be immune to accountability. Yet even as the raids unfolded, uncertainty lingered. The Garda didn't know what they would find, or whether what they found would change the course of an investigation already steeped in secrecy. In the days that followed, questions would multiply faster than answers, about power, protection, and the thin line between fear and justice. Because in Dublin's underworld, every raid is more than an act of enforcement. It's a declaration of who truly controls the night. Long before the raid, there were signs that something was stirring beneath Dublin's calm surface. In the months leading up to it, the Garda National Crime and Security Intelligence Service began picking up fragments of information, snippets of conversations, intercepted messages, subtle shifts in behavior within known criminal circles. What at first appeared to be street gossip slowly evolved into something far more deliberate, a network of whispers suggesting a Garda officer had been marked. The threats weren't loud or careless. They were planned, calculated, and delivered through channels meant to intimidate without leaving a trace. By the time investigators confirmed that the threats were real, the sense of danger had moved from rumor to reality. The pressure inside Garda headquarters grew heavier with every passing week, and in the background, one name kept circling back to the surface: Graham, the Whig Whelan. To the public, Whelan's life had always been a paradox. Lavish yet haunted, silent yet constantly in the news. He was part of the fabric of Dublin's underworld, woven into the legacy of the Kinahan organization, a crime network that stretched from the streets of Ireland to the beaches of southern Spain. His connections were both his shield and his curse. People close to him described a man who had grown more careful, more withdrawn, but also more unpredictable. The older he became, the less he trusted anyone, and in the criminal world, that kind of isolation often comes just before something breaks. Garda intelligence analysts believed that if anyone could issue or orchestrate a threat against law enforcement, it would come from someone within his circle, someone protected by proximity and fear. But proving that theory would take more than suspicion. It would take evidence, and in Whelan's world, evidence had a habit of disappearing. Tension rose as surveillance deepened. Officers spent long nights parked outside homes, cameras hidden inside unmarked vans, tracking calls that led to burner phones and untraceable SIMs. A quiet war was unfolding in the background, a battle of patience and precision between those sworn to uphold the law and those convinced they could outsmart it. Reports came in of shifting alliances, of men once loyal to Whelan suddenly keeping their distance, and of rival groups whispering that a major operation was on the horizon. The Garda were closing in, but they also knew the risk. If the wrong move was made, someone could end up dead. Every lead brought more questions, and every silence from Whelan's camp only fed the uncertainty. By the final week of September, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Garda briefings turned into long, tense nights of planning, and the Special Detective Unit was on standby for what was described as a strategic intervention. Warrants were signed, operations mapped out, and intelligence sealed under strict confidentiality. For investigators, it felt like standing on the edge of a storm. They could sense what was coming but had no control over how violent it might be. What they didn't know was that this operation would do more than test their resolve. It would pull back the curtain on a network that had survived through silence, fear, and money. And when the first doors finally came crashing down, Dublin's criminal underworld would learn that the era of quiet intimidation was coming to an end. The night of the raid began with a silence so heavy it felt almost unnatural. Just before dawn, while the rest of South Dublin still slept, a convoy of unmarked cars moved in unison through narrow residential streets. The operation had been rehearsed down to the second. Armed units advanced under strict radio silence, their faces hidden beneath helmets, their weapons drawn but low. They knew the risk of waking a man like Graham the Whig Whelan, someone with connections, someone who had survived the streets by expecting betrayal at every turn. As the first team took position near his property, the only sounds were the steady hum of engines and the faint whisper of rain against the roofs. Then came the signal. Within seconds, the door gave way. The night split open by a rush of movement that marked the beginning of one of the most decisive Garda raids in years. Inside the home, chaos met control. Officers fanned out, clearing rooms with precision, calling out confirmations through short bursts of coded speech. Whelan, startled and disoriented, reportedly emerged from his bedroom in disbelief, surrounded by tactical lights and armed men. No shots were fired, but the tension was palpable, each second thick with the weight of what could happen if control slipped. The search was meticulous. Drawers opened, electronic devices unplugged, documents bagged and labeled. In one corner of the house, investigators uncovered encrypted phones, flash drives, and handwritten notes containing partial codes and initials. But what they didn't find was just as telling. No weapons, no direct evidence linking him to the threats, nothing that screamed guilt or innocence. It was a puzzle that demanded interpretation rather than conclusion. By morning, the operation had expanded beyond one home. Across South Dublin, 5 other locations connected to Whelan's associates were searched simultaneously. Some were empty. Others held fragments of information that hinted at deeper networks. At one address, a vehicle linked to a known intermediary was seized. At another, a ledger filled with transaction initials and unexplained transfers was taken for forensic review. Each find added another thread to an already tangled web. For Garda intelligence, the results were both a success and a frustration. They had touched something powerful but hadn't grasped it fully. In Whelan's home, the atmosphere shifted from defiance to calculation. He remained silent, his expression unreadable. As officers moved in and out, his life's private world turned into an open exhibit. By the time the sun rose, the raid had made headlines, but inside Garda headquarters, the celebration was cautious. The operation had exposed the fragile balance between power and fear, between silence and revelation. Analysts spent hours piecing together data, cross-referencing calls, mapping connections, trying to determine whether this was the end of a threat or the beginning of something much darker. Outside, media cameras waited for answers, but none came. Within the walls of power, the question was not whether Whelan was guilty. It was whether he was the one giving the orders, or simply a man caught in the middle of a crime world that had begun to eat its own. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The raid had shifted the balance, and for the first time in years, Dublin's underworld had been forced to hold its breath. By sunrise, the echoes of the raid had spilled into the media like wildfire. Headlines screamed across Ireland's morning papers, each telling the same story with different shades of speculation. The home of Graham, the Whig Whelan, long linked to the Kinahan network, had been stormed in connection with threats made against a Garda officer. Yet, behind the front pages and flashing cameras, inside the walls of Garda headquarters, the aftermath was far from clear. The operation had been a success in execution but a mystery in outcome. Officers had recovered materials that raised more questions than they answered. Encrypted phones, coded notes, and surveillance gear that hinted at coordination but offered no direct confession. Senior Garda sources were careful with their words, describing the findings as significant but sensitive. It was the kind of statement that fueled both curiosity and doubt, leaving the public to wonder whether justice had truly found its mark or simply brushed against it. Whelan himself remained silent in the days that followed, his reputation once again becoming both his armor and his prison. Through his legal team, he issued a calm but firm denial, insisting he had no knowledge of any threats and that his life was now focused on family and peace. Those close to him described him as composed, even amused, but those who knew the rhythm of organized crime in Dublin sensed something different. Fear disguised as control. In the underworld, raids like this didn't just expose one man. They rattled entire hierarchies. Associates began to distance themselves, phones went dark, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the old guard had been shaken from its throne. But for Garda investigators, the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It meant the message had landed, loud enough to remind everyone that the law could still reach behind fortified walls, but not deep enough to end the cycle that had made such raids necessary in the first place. Weeks turned into months, and the case slowly drifted from the headlines, replaced by fresher scandals and newer tragedies. Still, for those within the force, the shadow of the operation lingered. There were rumors of files sealed under national security labels, of potential links that stretched beyond Whelan's network into the politics of protection. Whispers that some names were too powerful to print. The targeted Garda officer, whose identity remained undisclosed for safety reasons, was quietly relocated, a decision that spoke volumes about the depth of the threat that started it all. In Dublin's bars and backstreets, men who once bragged about connections now spoke in lower tones. For a fleeting moment, fear had changed direction. from the public toward those who had spent years hiding in plain sight. But justice in this world rarely ends in one act. Despite the operation's scale and precision, no formal charges were filed against Whelan in connection to the threats. The official narrative was one of ongoing investigation, but those familiar with Irish crime knew what that meant. The evidence existed in whispers, not in courtrooms. Public trust swayed uneasily between admiration and exhaustion. Admiration for a force brave enough to act, exhaustion for a system too cautious to conclude. As autumn faded into winter, the tension subsided, but not the uncertainty. The raid had shown Ireland that even the most feared names could be reached, yet it also revealed how fragile that reach could be. Behind the quiet of Dublin nights, questions still hung unanswered. Not about what was found, but about what was left unseen. In the end, this story isn't just about one man or one raid. It's about the long shadow of power and fear that still hovers over Ireland's criminal landscape. Graham the Whig Whelan remains both a symbol and a question mark, a reminder of how blurred the lines can become between legend and reality in the underworld. His house may have been searched, his name dragged once again through the court of public opinion, but beneath all the headlines lies something deeper, an uneasy truth about what power means in a city where silence can be deadlier than a gun. The Garda's message was clear: no one is beyond reach. But the absence of a conviction, the quiet after the storm, left an unsettling reminder that justice can feel both present and far away at the same time. For Dublin, the raid became a mirror reflecting decades of entanglement between law and crime. The Kinahan network, though weakened, still casts its influence across the city, operating through layers of loyalty, money, and fear. Communities have learned to live with the double reality. Police raids at night, normal life by morning. Mothers still whisper their worries. But even amid the uncertainty, there's something undeniably human about this story. The raid wasn't just an operation. It was a reflection of courage, of people who risked their lives to defend the law in a world that often punishes those who do. It was about families waiting for their loved ones to return home from duty, and about the communities who dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the balance was shifting. It was also about the fragility of justice, how it bends under pressure, how it struggles to stand tall in the face of influence, and how easily truth can be buried beneath reputation. When you strip away the names and headlines, what remains are people, caught between duty, loyalty, and fear, trying to make sense of a world that rarely gives straight answers. And so, as this story closes, the questions remain. Did the Garda uncover the truth behind the threats, or did the trail die in silence? Was this operation a warning to Whelan, or to everyone watching from the shadows? The answers may never come, but the message is yours to interpret. Comment below with your theory. Was this a victory for justice or a reminder of how fragile power can be? And if you want to see more untold stories that reveal what really happens behind Ireland's most secretive cases, subscribe, share this video, and stay tuned. Because the truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to surface. And sometimes, it begins with the sound of a door breaking in the dark.